There are also some other ideas which I found really interesting. So there's an idea in ecosystems of ecosystem goods and ecosystem services. So an ecosystem good is like having a forest and you cut it down to have the wood to make tables or buildings. That's something you take out of the system. That's the sort of technology we take out of science. From the ecosystem of science, we directly take what I've shown you before. But ecosystem services is more like, well, the forest produces actually the oxygen that we need over the whole planet. Or it's actually a beautiful place that inspires us when we go walking in it. And that's one of the problems of our society, is that we forget to value the ecosystem services part of the equation, and we just privilege goods. But for our society, we need the services. So actually, this is more like when we talk about mathematics and the beauty of mathematics. So mathematicians have always had this embarrassment that, or actually particle physicists as well. We like beautiful theories, but we're not really allowed to say that. It's not supposed to be a criteria that you do science because it's beautiful. But it comes under more of that idea, that it's actually part of the system. We should foster it. It's very, very important as well. And then one that often doesn't get talked about is actually the media. So science has become more and more interesting to people over time. We know it affects us, but actually just the general interest in science is growing hugely as well. So you hear it on the radio, you read about it, you see it on TV or podcasts, and there are whole lots of people involved in that aspect. And then finally there's all of us as well. So we're a little bit outside looking in at this entire ecosystem. So when you start to look at that, you realize that there's an enormous amount of competition in this system at all levels. So scientists compete with each other. That's what I was trying to say. I want to be the first so I can publish. But the journals themselves, they're competing against each other. They want to be the most read scientific journal, what we would call the highest impact, publishes the most important things. Or the science programs, say, or podcasts, they're competing with each other. The universities, they're competing with each other. There's now ranking of the universities in the world. So they compete very strongly with each other. Different countries compete with each other. Different funders in the same country compete. They want to fund the good science and not the bad science, but which is the best? So people compete very strongly for fellowships. So all through this system is competition. And then there are lots of interactions. That's my best mess of a map. You can do it in different ways. You can try and model the system. So it really is an ecosystem. There's lots of strong interactions between different bits of it. And part of this is the answer to the question that I was posing a bit before, which is, why do people say, I'd love to change the system, but it's their system and they can't change it? And it's because there's all these intense interactions and they lock the system. Nobody can choose to do something differently because they'd have to change the whole system, but nobody has control over the whole system. There are some other interesting things here. For instance, if we look at the part over here on the science we hear about. So all of you, me included, I hear about 0.001% of all the science that's being done. It's a tiny, tiny fraction. It feels like a lot sometimes, because you have to read about it every day. Who chooses the science that I get to hear about, or you get to hear about? I don't know if you worry about that. You should do, because there's a lot you're not hearing about. So which bits do you not hear about? Who chooses? And of course, it's partly, so there are people who are very good professionals who are choosing. They're choosing the bit that you're going to read, because the average time that you'll spend on reading any article is 7 seconds. Right? And so we have very poor attention spans, all of us. So we get fed what suits our attention spans, which is a 7 seconds headline plus the first sentence. And then if you're really lucky, you might get to the next sentence, and so on. So we get given the science that will keep us reading a bit longer, that we want to read about. And generally, it's that we don't have to do any work, and we understand why the science is important. That's why you always read about cancer, because you know about it, and you don't need any introduction to cancer, so you can immediately go into some science. You read about particle accelerators. The whole series of things that there's hooks already. They're already, if you like, the introductions are already in your heads, so a science journalist doesn't need to give those. But there is an interesting thing, because there's a very small number of people in the media world who actually control that. It's like a bottleneck, very small number of people who are controlling what science gets heard about. So we should worry about that. There are all sorts of other strange things in the system. So the number of scientists grows at 4% a year. We can ask, what about conferences? So I talk to all scientists. They all say, there's too many conferences. Yes, I go to many more conferences than I used to. Actually, there's no data, absolutely zero data about it. You can look at things like some of the big conferences, how they've grown over time. So there are some conferences, like the US Chemistry Conference has something like 25,000 people going to it for a week and has carried on growing. It's just massive. Why do I go to a conference? I go to a conference actually to accidentally meet somebody I've never met before, to have a really interesting conversation about something I knew nothing about and hit it off with them and maybe think about a new idea. That's why I go to a conference. But conferences of 25,000 people are not designed to make that work. It's designed like there are hundreds of parallel sessions. Your scientists are running in between them trying to get to the next talk. I mean, they talk to the people they know because it's like, safe. We're scared of each other a little bit. But you don't know who to talk to. So we don't think about that as scientists. It's very odd. There's a whole space here where we could really change how we do science that would actually deliver what we want to. And then, so the interesting thing is the EU, part of the EU's investment in science, which has been fantastic over the years, has been increasing the amount of funding for going to meetings. That's what they do. They want scientists around Europe to talk to each other. And it's good because they don't duplicate each other's work now. You can't hide your head in the sand in the north of England, and I'm doing my experiment. I don't really care about yours. It's in your face because you have to talk to other people around Europe. So that's good, but everybody's traveling a lot more. It's a great subsidy for hotels, restaurants, and airlines. So the EU is very happy. That's why. But that budget is huge. I mean, it's an enormous budget. It's been I think 5 billion over the last 5 years, and it keeps on going up. Do we know if that's well spent? Should we have more conferences or less conferences? And it's an answer that nobody really has any idea how to. They don't even have the numbers. So actually, that's one of the things I'm trying to do on the website is get scientists and people who go to conferences, media, to actually just talk about their experiences and try and collect some hard data. So that's something, probably because we don't ever rate conferences, that at the moment is hard to change. So normally, we'll see in a second that actually you can make sort of something. Everybody wants to go to one conference because it's the best conference. Then the quality of that conference might increase. There might be a reason to make it better. But conferences at the moment, we don't do that to conferences, and that's probably what we should do. We should say that conference should die. But actually, every time you do that, people find a reason to keep it going because there's more scientists. And they want to have more talks, and more scientists also means that there are more small conferences that are around your field, and so you don't go to as different a conference as before. So it actually stops the communication of knowledge between disciplines when this happens as well. So there are some unforeseen consequences of that. Another consequence that many scientists are aware of and have really no idea what to do with is the fact that the amount of knowledge that's generated is just increasing terrifyingly. So there are 22,000 new science journals started up every year. That's not the number we have, that's the number that's started every year in all disciplines. And millions and millions of new articles each year, so there's no way scientists can keep track of them. So how do I decide what to read? Even in my field, I can drill it down as small as I want. I still can't read all the things that are being produced in that field. So I have to find a way to do that. And that's why there's this pecking order of scientific journals. Because the ones that are really esteemed are really hard to get into. You have to do something major. And we'll talk about how that's decided. But then if it's in there, then I'll know it's actually major. So it's worth reading. And so there's a fact that there's a pecking order of journals. People want to do away with that. They'd say, well, maybe we should just put all the information we generate on the web and let people talk about it. We shouldn't have this journals like Nature, which is the one that's most difficult to get into. But actually, I need that. I need that to help me sort this morass of information. So that's the difficulty. It's a love-hate relationship. And scientists are generally paid not really in money, we have a job, but actually we're paid in esteem. So if you work in an industry, when I worked in an industry, I did not tell everybody the secret thing that I was doing that was going to make the company a lot of money. We kept it back in the company. If it was a clever technique, we didn't tell people about it. And that's how companies survive. And although you think of companies as being very competitive, they're nothing compared to academia. Because in academic research, to get any rewards, you have to give away all your knowledge, all of it. So you give it away to everybody, and then they give you esteem back, right? And it's really good for society. It's a bargain, like a Faustian bargain we got into. It's a very good deal for society. It means that knowledge is really transferred around. I can find out about it relatively easily. But the downside is this, huge competition that then emerges, because to get the esteem, I have to publish before you and get into a higher impact journal. So we make people unhappy, but then at least it helps sort this problem of the mountain of information. So we actually have to find some other ways to deal with this, I would argue. It's interesting that when I do a search for scientific information, it's not very different for you doing a search for scientific information. It's basically something a bit like Google. And so, as it's always in Google, you see the first page, and then there's 23,000 other pages, right, which you probably don't look at. But of course, in science, the most important information is probably buried somewhere on the 13,000th page. So we don't actually have very good tools for understanding this web of knowledge that we've created. We have to figure out how we're going to do a better job at that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about how the science publishing system works, because there's some very peculiar things that have emerged from it as well. So essentially what I'm showing here is that this is the sort of set of scientists. So if you like, this is the machismo side, I don't know. This is the competitive side. On this side over here is actually what we've generated. The most amazing thing is that the system of science that we produce here that's really odd, this enormous competition, somehow filters out something here which is really useful for society. So a sum total of knowledge in the science area and science and engineering area is just amazing, and generally it's reliable. People worry about it, say, particularly in social sciences, but I'm not really going to talk about social sciences here because it's an unbelievably small fraction of the total amount of science that's done. Biological sciences, people also worry about, but that's just because it's a very complicated system and they're getting better. But still, I would argue that this web of knowledge is it's like a tree, bits of it that aren't really affixed properly drop off in the end, or they get covered up. So in the end, you get this very strong, very interconnected structure, which you can just trust. So the way it happens, if somebody gives me some money to do science, I hope, and I'm doing something, and then I have a nice, interesting result that I think, I can tell a story for this that will be really interesting for people. So we don't just tell what we've done because it's actually very boring and nobody really gets the information. You actually have to make it into something that really is a story. That's how we learn, really, through stories. So then I write it up in some way and I send it to a journal, and I make a decision, well, I want to send it to the highest impact because that's going to reflect well on me. You'll see why in a minute. And so I send it to the highest impact journal, and they send it to a set of people in a field who judge, and they complain, and then there's a discussion through the journal about whether I should improve it, and they'll maybe say, it's interesting, but not that interesting, so go away, go to a lower journal. So it sort of sinks down until it finds its level for the community. It might be fantastic, but there's just nobody alive yet who really appreciates it. And that actually happens a lot. The most cited papers are often not in the best journals. The very first one, because there was no people working on it at the time. It was the first. So it got, lower down, and then everybody realized, actually, that's major, and it becomes up. So being first is very bad. Being second is good, sometimes. So then eventually it gets published, and the thing is that when I publish my paper, I have to link it to all the work that was done before, so that people can see what the advance is specifically. If you're like, this is what's known already, and I've done a bit more than that. And linking it together is important. So every time I make a link formally, you can see which paper I've referred to. It's called a citation. So that author accrues now a little bit of extra veneration. We count the number of citations. Some people will look it up every day. I know them. It's terrifying, and it goes up daily, and then the paper I publish will get new citations to it, so I can see how interesting this paper was really. And the journal, which has published a set of papers, also can see how its papers are being referred to, and we can actually generate a number from it. So we can get a number called the citation impact factor of the journal, and also each scientist has a citation number. So not just a total number, but actually something called an H number, which is it's a statistical way of doing it. It gets harder and harder to get a higher H number. That's the thing about it. I mean, naturally, as you get older, more people cite your papers. But basically, it's a very hard thing to gain. So it's an interesting system. It means that, so then you can measure yourself. Where do I sit in the tens of millions of scientists that we are here? And where does each journal sit? So by and large, it's sort of stable, though it's not a very nice system, because it creates this intense competition here. However, the really interesting thing about it is I said that scientists were paid in esteem. And until about 15 years ago, it really was just, if I wanted a promotion, then somebody would ask some people around the world, how good is Baumberg? Is he, well, it's middling, not really yet. Maybe when he's older. So it was that sort of network. But that's not what happens now. Now, we can all be measured by an individual number. And what's really happened is that this has taken over from the idea of a community esteem. It's harder because if I have 100 people wanted to come and work with me, how am I going to read 100, their work and get letters from the referees? I can't possibly do that. So I have to filter them somehow. So paradoxically, globalization, opening up of science, has created some problems for us. So more people can apply for the same job. And I'm not finding it any easier to decide. I just have a bigger problem. So we have to use metrics more. So this creates a really difficult problem. So actually, this is a Bitcoin. So I'd contend that scientists accidentally created the world's first Bitcoin about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when we started to be able to electronically track all these paper citations. And nowadays, it's exactly like a Bitcoin, because when the paper is published, it's available everywhere, and all the citations are immediately calculated, and it's a global thing. It's not held on any particular computer anywhere. Everybody has it. It's distributed around the system. So that's like a blockchain. It's verifiable. Nobody can game it. Very hard. So, and you take funding in, just like a Bitcoin, and I create, instead of creating numbers from an algorithm, in this time, I'm actually mining real science. So it's sort of a useful thing. But it has all the problems of a currency. So it really is. It's exactly a Bitcoin. So the problem about this Bitcoin is, well, there's two things. One of them is it is actually monetizable. So I can take my H factor and I can use it to improve my salary. Or I can use it to get more resources, grants, or people. So it's got different conversion rates in different countries, by the way. So there's a whole lot of interesting ideas around that. But the other problem with it is that I said that the number of scientists is increasing at 4% a year. So it's not exactly how Bitcoin then changes, but Bitcoin essentially is worth less every year. That's called inflation. We're very familiar with what happens in a financial system. When we have inflation, you just get poorer. And so it's one of the reasons I think that scientists have felt ever more pressured over the last 15 or 20 years. If you talk to scientists, they say, well, it was so much better before. It didn't have this competition. In fact, what they're responding to is this inflation in accrual of esteem. It gets harder and harder, essentially, to get the same amount of esteem. So you work harder. So everybody tries to compete more. So that's a bit of a difficulty. Because we don't really control this as an economic system. And actually, systems that have inflation over a long time, it's good if you have a debt to pay off, but it's not good if you're paid in it because it just erodes away. So it's not completely clear what will happen in that system. I'm not a good enough economist to try and figure what's the end result of this. But at the moment, it is a problem for science generally. Okay. So we can also think about funding. Often when I talk to people, I mean, you're educated, you probably have some ideas, but when you go to do public workshops on public focus groups, and you ask, well, how do we decide what science gets done? So who decides what science gets done? Normally, the idea is that, well, at least there are some people who know, and they look at the science needs for the country, and they sort of decide what science gets done, and they allocate it around, and that's the science that gets done. It's not, I have an idea, and I get some friends to look through my idea, and they say, that's a good idea, we'll give you some money to do that, which is what really happens. In a system that's quite good. Scientists would say it's very defendable, it produces the best science, it's the most efficient way of doing it, but there's nothing strategic really about it. We just do science we think is interesting and likely to go somewhere. So that makes it's an interesting problem. So it's actually historic, the way we do science. As I said before, this is what we've inherited, and most scientists can't imagine doing anything different. This is just the way it is. But you can imagine all sorts of different ways of doing funding. So this is an imagining of that you might gamify funding. So we might decide, when somebody has an idea for doing some science, and it's above a quality threshold that's this really good piece of science, and we have far too many of these to fund at the moment, what we actually should do is we should have the public decide. So, because that would be great. It'd be great theatre as well. So there's like a game show, and you'd present, this is science, that's why I'm trying to do this, and then the public would vote. And then they would have an interest in that piece of science. When you've got that far involved, you actually want to know what happened. So that would be quite interesting. Scary for my colleagues. But it's not completely clear to me. I mean, you could find that people, of course, then scientists would start to hire marketing facilitators who would give the talks, and there'd be a whole industry around it. But it would actually further the interaction and the discussion about what we spend our money on. Could be really good, could be really bad. You might only do certain things like try and cure cancer, which unfortunately needs all these other bits of science to help it. But then people would learn that. Could imagine another way of doing science funding. So this is one where it's a bit like jury service. We don't really have this yet. So you have to go and spend 6 months in a forest in Japan, and that's where the world science, decides in sort of you become a monk or a nun for 6 months. And then because you're disinterested, you're pulled out of your own background and thinking about, what should we do in this area? Where should it go? So it could be like that, a meditative sort of way of deciding on science. Or, why are humans deciding on science? They can't read. There's 25 million papers a year. I can't possibly read that. But a computer could. So we haven't done this yet, but AIs that actually look at this web of knowledge and try and understand where the gaps are in it. This is something that will come. There are not enough big projects in this area, in my view. It's a really open area because science has a certain way, a certain language, a certain way of talking, and it would be quite effective, I think, as a way of trying to identify gaps. And I predict that in 10 years' time, I will not be able to apply for funding without the AI actually confirming that this is an interesting funding space. Somebody hasn't done it before, because that's often what happens, or it actually looks distinguishable and going in some different directions. So it's interesting that scientists there's very little discussion of this sort of thing. Playing with the margins, but not trying to do something radically different. So, it's a bit like a Pandora's box. Once you start looking at science as an ecosystem, then a lot of questions emerge about why do we do science in this way and how we might actually change it. So I wrote this book, and my plan was, okay, let me write the book, and I just want to show the state of science. This is what we're all in a system. And if you're young and coming into science, you should be thinking, okay, what could we do about that? But everybody who read the book said, you can't do that. You have to tell us what to do. That's dangerous. Right? So I actually did have to try and think about what interventions might actually be productive. And I'll talk about just a very few of them. I think one of the things that overall has come out to me is that I always had this idea that globalization was a really good thing in science. I mean, for me, it felt like, you communicate with people all around the world. There's a diversity of attitudes. Science will prosper the more that we just let knowledge be free. And actually, I'm no longer so sure. Because what happens is that, well, there are a couple of things. One of them is that this massive competition, that the feeling of competition grows, and that has some unforeseen consequences in the system about what science gets done. But there's another one is that the way that we do science, say the way we do funding, becomes more and more the same way everywhere. What happens? Everybody chooses the best practice. That actually Britain is very, very efficient in the way that it allocates science funding. We spend very little on administering. Generally, our system is incredibly efficient. It's one of the reasons that I'm in the UK. But now Europe has copied that, and Korea has copied that. There are different bits of it. So everybody starts to do science funding the same way. It's efficient, you might say, but the problem is, if I go to every country, they tell me, oh, we're going to select just a few areas, and those are the parts that we concentrate on, and we distinguish ourselves. And then I ask them, well, what are you concentrating on? Oh, big data. Everybody's doing big data. Everybody chooses exactly the same things. So what happens in any ecosystem is that you lose diversity. When it becomes big and very connected, and winner takes all, if you like, so you start to have only certain species in the system. And what happens in that ecosystem is it loses resilience. If it gets pushed in different directions, it's no longer able to keep in its position. And that's not so good for a science system. So I think you can see all the time this loss of diversity in the science system. It keeps happening. Basically, everywhere around the world is starting to do science in the same way. I no longer think that's so good. People who are, if you like, we used to have this idea of Occam's razor in science. You wanted to find the very simplest explanation for a phenomenon. But because of this idea of impact, and you actually make a very overblown, complicated explanation now. Hocus pocus, quantum, entanglement, linked to bio, and then people say, oh, it must be very good, actually. But we forget, and actually editors don't ask this, what's the simplest explanation for this phenomenon? And it would be fantastic to have that brought back into science. So that's part of what science curators do, as well as working with the AIs to find, these areas are really unexplored. This is good territory to work in. So we lack those people at the moment. One of the things that we know in our own society about money is that it's a very one-dimensional measure. The good thing about Britain is when you meet somebody, the first question is not, how much money do you make? Which is actually what happens in America a bit more. Because we actually like to be multidimensional in the way that we understand each other. We have different things. But the problem about this citations, this H metric, is that it's one-dimensional. So we need other ways of measuring, like cooperation, or so different ways. And we haven't produced those at all at the moment. And then finally, the thing that I'm most happy to encourage is creative anarchy. And that's actually my role in Cambridge as I see it, though not for the people I work with. But actually it's really important. This is to fight this loss of diversity in the science ecosystem. We have to find ways to do things in a new way. And often you can't, I never ask for permission, just do it and then let them catch up. And if it's good, then people will use it. If not, it was an experiment and we'll bin that. So I think that's anybody who's involved in science, I'm really encouraging of that, or in the science ecosystem. This creative anarchy, we need to try different ways to be doing science, to be funding it. So for instance, now we have a lot of money coming from the tech sector of people who are interested in putting money back in, but in curious ways. They want to have control of it, they'll make rockets or get involved in brain research. But it's still interesting and it's still valuable. I used to think, but actually it is very valuable because it's a different way of thinking about it.